So we want to keep the presentations short so that there's more time for interaction and discussion. Because as you know, this is a hot topic. It affects everybody in Singapore, and not just the 80% of the population that actually lives in HDB flats. But this whole question of public housing has been a major point of contention. It's one of those things that people talk about as sort of something that Singapore has really given to the world. And in theory, you know, it's an achievement. It's certainly an achievement being able to provide safe, clean housing for a large proportion of the population. But the trouble is with everything else, once you build on something, there's always a tendency to try and change it into something that it was not. And I think that has become apparent in the last few weeks and months in the discussions and the dialogues that have been going on. My name is Paul Tambyah. I'm the chairman of the SDP. I'm an infectious disease physician. On my right is Wendy, who is the chairman of the head of the women's wing of PSP, and Azhar, who is a Cadre member of the SDP. Please take a seat. So I'm going to start the ball rolling. Okay, so basically I'm going to cover a few areas. The issue of the BTOQ, the flats which are seen as profit opportunities, the fear of raiding the reserves, which for some reason applies only to young couples looking for affordable housing, and then the elephant in the room, which is why is there a need for so many people in Singapore. I'm also going to touch briefly on the SDP housing plan. And after that, Wendy will talk about the PSP proposal, and then Azhar will give industry perspective on what are some of the gaps in the system and how they can be addressed. So, you know, people seem to think that BTO is like written in stone, or that it's like a sacred cow, it's been here forever. But the reality is it's barely 21 years old. And a very good source for information about how BTO started and why it started is in this book put out by MND, which is a collection of articles written by the former Minister Mah Tan. And he pointed out that when he took over as the MND minister, there were thousands of unsold flats. So his problem was not people waiting to a flat, it was flats waiting for people. And his argument then was that was a big problem, because he says that that many unsold flats represented a waste of taxpayers' money. The holding cost was money that could have been spent on healthcare, education, and other areas. So instead of the government eating the cost of looking after those flats, he decided to put a major brake on the building of the flats, which of course resulted in this switch in the supply and demand situation. And so instead of the government worrying about where's your education, spending your money on other things, people now have to start worrying about what to do with the money. So and their money ends up getting tied up in a BTO flat, which is a theme which is going to keep coming through, I think, as you've heard from PSP in Parliament, as well as from what we have been talking about for some time. So in this article, which Minister Ma put out in the Today newspaper in 2020, he pointed out that the old system, which was you bid for a flat in a particular sector and then you just take the flat in that sector, you cannot take the exact flat, unlike the BTO, which is built to order. So you choose the exact location of the flat that you want. The difference, of course, is that HDB was building flats ahead of demand, whereas with BTO, they're building flats in response to demand. And the original plan was when there's a 70% order, then they will start building. Apparently, they've started building earlier. They haven't given us the exact figure of when it was. But this table was in Minister Ma's article. And he pointed out that the benefit essentially for BTO is more to the system, because then the system can build flats when they're needed, and there's no overhang, there's no excess flats to worry about. But on the other hand, with RFS, the benefit is actually to the individual, because you need a flat, there is a flat. You know, so the question is goes back to who is the housing system for? Is it for the system or is it for the individual? But anyway, that's the history from about 10 years ago. But part of the spillover effect of this is the idea that in many Singaporeans' mind, housing is no longer something that you're a roof over your head or a place where you can raise your family, but rather it becomes an asset to be traded. And this idea is being perpetrated sort of both directly and indirectly. But in reality, if you do a straw poll, I did a straw poll of people I knew, and a significant number of them have moved at most once in their life. People of my vintage. There are, of course, those who keep flipping flats, and there are 2 or 3 of them, and they've had their ups and downs, Asian financial crisis, 2008, this kind of thing. But a significant proportion of Singaporeans have lived in one flat their whole life. I always tell this story about my mom. She's lived in the same place for 50 years, but she's moved to 6 different constituencies because they keep redrawing the boundaries. And she's not the only one. So a consequence of this has been the situation which we now have, where you've got people with empty BTO flats. This individual who actually left the BTO flat vacant for 5 years. There's a BTO flat that was vacant for 8 years. It's obvious this guy doesn't need a roof over his head. He's just buying the flat so that he can monetize it and flip it and make a profit. And in fact, he has got so much of a buffer that he doesn't mind leaving it empty for 5 years. And then as soon as the 5 years is up, he flips it. So M&D has said that they will go after these individuals. They have apparently gone after some of the property agents. We haven't seen a prosecution of one of the owners. Who knows, they may get a stern warning. So the result of this is that, I'm sure you've seen this meme that's been going around, is that as HDB prices have been going up, they become less affordable. And I know I speak from a position of privilege because as doctors we get paid a lot more than most people. But I dug up an old payslip from 1992. In 1992, as a MO, 3 months after my ORD, I was earning $3,000 gross salary. My take-home pay was about $2,400. In 2023, according to the Channel News Asia, MOs are earning about $5,000 to $6,000, and I believe that this is pretty accurate. But in 1992, if you look at the HDB's website, the resale price index was at 26 to 28. In 2022, it's at 170. So in other words, the price of HDB flats, and this is resale flats, okay, to be fair, but the price of BTO, the price of RFS flats somehow seems to somewhat track the resale index or be a little bit lagging behind. But the salary of an MO has practically doubled, gone about 2.5 times what it was before. But the price of a flat has actually gone up by about 5 times. So what it means is that even though I'm making more, the MOs now are making more than I made 30 years ago, what they can buy with what they're making is much less than what I could buy 30 years ago. So the reality is, whether, there's this huge debate about what is affordable, what is not affordable. And the government thinks that if you spend your entire retirement savings every month on your flat purchase, that's considered affordable. But it is no dispute that flats are less affordable now than they were 30 years ago. Okay? And again, it's not just the MO's pay which we're talking about, because in every other profession, there has been an increase in salary, but it has not kept up. I can't think of any profession where the salary has actually kept up with the increase in HDB prices. So the argument that is used is that, okay, if we reduce the price of HDB, then we will be stealing from the reserves for future generations. But frankly, if you look at other services which are provided by the public sector, and again, this is an area I know a little bit about, which is public sector A-class wards, which stirred quite a bit of interest recently. So this is the price for a cardiac bypass surgery in an A-class ward in a public hospital. And it ranges from around 40,000. In private hospitals in Singapore, the price is around 80,000. Okay, and it's possible that the land cost in Novena is a lot more than the land cost in Tan Tock Seng, which happens to be just across the road. Okay, maybe, but I don't think it's twice the land cost. So clearly there is something going on over here, and the desire to recover the land costs seems to be more acute when it comes to a young working couple rather than a medical tourist going in for an expensive surgical procedure. So again, without more data, it's very hard to understand why this happens. But to anyone just looking at the numbers themselves, this is the question that comes up. Why is it so important to recover the cost from these young couples? And if you look at the statement, this statement just came out last week from Ministry of Finance, where they said government spending could exceed 20% of GDP, so GST and other tax measures are required. So I thought this statement is a bit odd. And I read further down into the article, and you see the MOF spokesman has said, when compared with other advanced economies, this overall expenditure is relatively small, and it reflects the government's focus on fiscal prudence and cost-effective spending. So I tried to see where does this 20% put us, and I went to the IMF website. And if you go to the IMF website, you'll see the countries that are 19% are Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. What does Japan, Germany spend? They spend 40%, 50% of their GDP is government expenditure. The UK is another 40%. US actually is on the lowish side at about 40-something%. So most of the high-income countries are spending 40-50%, the governments are spending 40-50% of the GDP. But in Singapore, the expenditure is a lot less. A lot of that is because there's no, or there's a very limited social safety net. There's very few pensions. The government contribution to healthcare is relatively small. And there are multiple other factors. But in general, if you look at a graph like this, the question that comes up is, why is the government so kiasu? In other words, and why do they feel that it's so important to keep our spending at the level of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka rather than Japan and Germany or Sweden for that matter? And coming back to this whole question of housing, I think, there's been a lot of talk about housing, about affordability, but the elephant in the room is, why do we need so many flats? Singapore is one of the world's lowest birth rates. And that's not a thing to be proud of, but that's the reality. Although, frankly, I can tell you, my wife and I, we have no kids. So every long weekend, we stay in Singapore because 1 million people leave the country. And then the traffic is great. It's happened post-COVID. During COVID, no fun. Everybody is still here. But the people leave the country, the malls are not so crowded, the restaurants are not so busy. So I personally think, maybe 3-4 million is the optimal population size for Singapore. But you can see from the SingStat data that really the population has just been going up relentlessly despite the relatively low birth rate. And the consequences have been significant. We've had loss of the Clementi forest, the Dover forest. Even in Kranji, you can see that they tried to get away with getting rid of the woodland. And in the end, there were 2 middle-ranking officials who got penalized for that. And this has just been going around. Terry Shee from TOC pointed it out to me, where the second minister, M&D minister, said that people who paid high prices for their flats would feel upset if the price of the flats dropped because of a change in the policy. But frankly, in my opinion, most of Singaporeans would rather their children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews have a better life than them. And in fact, this is reflected in some of the comments where they said to argue that it's fair, for fairness sake, new property owners should pay sky-high prices like how their predecessors did, is a kind of toxic mentality. And in reality, if your children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews are paying less for their flats, they have more money to spend on you, to take you on holiday, to take you out for lunch or things like that, rather than having that money tied into a property, which eventually is going to have zero value at the end of 99 years. So I think there are many, many questions that have to be asked. So this is the SDP housing policy. And in a nutshell, it actually argues that public housing should be for public housing. It's a public good. It's about putting a roof over their heads. It's not about competing with a private developer in providing some luxurious apartment for people who cannot really afford it but who meet certain income criteria. Public housing is ensuring that that individuals have clean, safe housing to live in. And that allows them to get on with the rest of their lives. So in our policy, we have argued there should be 2 categories of houses. There should be the non-open market housing, which you can only sell back to the HDB, which is how it was in the first days of HDB. Right at the beginning, there was no resale market when HDB was first established, when they took over from the SIT. But if you do want to sell, but that will cause a dramatic crash in the market. So we've argued that there should be an open market flats, which you should be freely able to sell on the open market. But then if you want to buy a new flat, you have to buy it on the non-open market system, or you have to pay the premium, which includes the land cost under the open market system. So our website currently has been having some issues, but you can read this, and we'll make it available to those of you who have signed up for this meeting. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to Wendy, who will present the PSP perspective on this housing issue. And then after that, Azhar will present the perspective from somebody who is in the industry itself. So a couple more points from the SDP's proposal. So the main thing is the non-open market and the open market flats. But there are other schemes that we have included in there, which include the priority for the young parents, making sure that divorcees, single mothers also have access to public housing, which is currently limited. Okay, good. Now the slides are up.
Hi, good afternoon. A quick introduction of myself. My name is Wendy, and I head the women's chapter in Progress Singapore Party. It was started very shortly after the last GE, and I think when we first gathered our women members to look at how we are going to be different from the PAP's women's wing and the broad agenda, we wanted to look at what it means to validate Singaporeans' women's experience. And so I think away from the normative conversation about how you should get married, you have your 2.1 kids, replace yourself, and then move on to apply for a BTO, we wanted to show that every Singaporean woman's journey counts. And so where we have distinguished ourselves is to establish an inclusivity agenda. And I think recently when you've looked at Manwai and Hazel's speech, it sort of reflects a lot of that thinking and a lot of that value as well as a party. So today when I had to go to my slides, I actually wanted to engage a little bit more on the conversation of affordability. And I know currently with the debate, there are two divergent thoughts, right? The incumbents think that HDBs remain affordable and accessible to Singaporeans. And of course, the opposition MPs and NCMPs have taken a different view. So for my broad topic, I will be covering these 4 issues on what we want to talk about when we are talking about affordability, accessibility, housing and total fertility rate, and then where PSP stands when it comes to a more inclusive social housing policy. And so when we start the whole debate about why incumbents keep reminding us that HDB remains affordable, I think if we start looking at the kind of measures they are using. And so where they have said they are starting from is to use residents' household income and the mortgage servicing ratio, the MSR. And that is actually the proportion of the monthly income that your general household uses to service the mortgage installment. And so by the first half of 2022, they have said that 90% of the buyers in non-mature estates and more than 80% of the buyers in mature estates had the MSR of 25% or lower. Meaning to say that they take the view that broadly Singaporeans are actually using a fairly low proportion of their household income to actually service their mortgage. And they compare that internationally with MSR of 30 to 35%. So right from the scholastic mind, they're already saying that, it's affordable because, look, Singaporeans can generally afford it and it's based on a lower MSR. So that is actually one of the measures which they have shared through CNA in December 2022. And then the next interesting statement from Desmond Lee is for him to say that 70% of the BTO flats remain affordable for the median household income of $8,400. But when we actually look at the graph of the monthly resident employed household income from work, when people think about the median income at $8,400, there is a sense that the average Singaporean earns $8,400. But graphically, when you look at the breakdown by the different decibels and the different proportion of income, you would see that the bandwidth of 8,000 to 8,999 actually marks 5.28%, right? So that's actually a very, very small bandwidth. And then, of course, there's the income going forward from there. But right below that, you actually have about 40% or more of your population which actually doesn't hit the income mark. And there was an article that came out from the Online Citizen. And so if you look at the analysis, even from Desmond Lee's statement, right, is one, BTO is actually unaffordable for 30%, even if your household median income meets the $8,400 mark. And that to me is actually an alarming statement, because you're talking about 30% of those who earn $8,400 not being able to meet even the entry-level price of a BTO, right? And so if you go into TOC's analysis, then you are really looking at 40% of your population earning below the median income of $8,400, who basically will find it difficult to meet the requirements of purchasing a BTO flat. And when you look at 25% of their MSR of $2,040 for a 25-year HDB housing loan, basically what TOC has analyzed is that you can basically buy a flat that's priced not more than $152,000 or thereabouts. But from Property Guru's website, which is quite a comprehensive property website, you find that the cheapest 3-room flat launched between 2019 to November 2022 in the Sembawang area is actually priced already at $163,000, right? So basically all these markers show that it's not just about looking at your median income, but for a significant proportion of your population, and including 30% of those who are already hitting the mark of $8,400, these people are not able to afford a BTO. And so I don't think it's about ground sentiments or empirical conversations that you had with residents, but the data is actually showing up quite clearly that this is a significant marker where we need to have a major rethink of our policy reset. The other marker that I've actually tried to look at is actually what has been surveyed by the NUS Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and NTU. And they've basically looked at the various minimum income standards for households. So interestingly, they have done quite a detailed study where they've looked at a household for a single parent with one child, 2 to 6 years old, requiring an income of $3,200. If you have a typical household of partnered parents with 2 children of certain school-going age, requiring a household income of $6,400. And you also look at a typical spending of a single elderly person, which I think has been the topic of conversation for some time, which is what's your minimal income required in Singapore, which is about $1,400. So based on that, you know, when we come back to Desmond Lee's statement again, if you're talking 25% of MSR by your median household income of $8,400, that leaves you with $2,100 for your mortgage. And when you look at 75% of that household income being left or parked aside for living expenses, that is actually extremely close to what we have in terms of the household minimum income that's required to keep your expenses going. So the net result of that is that Singaporeans, even if you are earning a total of $8,400 as a household, you're basically left with zero or nominal savings. Right, and I'm sure from your own conversations with your family, your cousins, your aunties, your household expenses may actually be more than that, but that's just a general national survey. So, of course, beyond your typical savings, the other conversation that has been spoken about by Manwa and Hazel is the depletion of our CPF savings. And generally, I think the graph has represented that, which is with the high cost of the housing, it actually depletes our CPF savings, which leaves very little for our retirement. And to the extent the house pricing must always rise, for otherwise the homeowners will lose their retirement egg. And I think one of the key reasons is that when they actually sell their flat, they realize that they actually have to return the accrued interest from the use of the CPF savings to park back into their CPF. So it feeds into a vicious cycle where the more you actually spend using your CPF savings, the more you actually have to sell at a higher price to meet that break-even point for you to pay back your CPF account with the accrued interest. And the reality, of course, we realize is that the price will actually not go up forever due to the lease decay issue, which is another major time bomb. So from MON's perspective, they are saying that HDB buyers use about 64 to 100% of their ordinary account contributions to pay for their HDB flats. And this could be especially serious for the lowest 20% in terms of their income levels, where 96 to 100% of the CPF contributions may actually go into your ordinary accounts to pay for the HDB flat. And for other income groups, this could be close to 2/3 or more which are used up. So as we're paying more and more for our HDB, the reality is that our CPF savings is actually being depleted. And added to the earlier problem which I mentioned is that you have very little disposable income left for your own savings. Basically, Singaporeans are just left with an asset that essentially is decaying over time, which to me is a double whammy, right? And so on the next broad issue about accessibility, again, Hazel has brought up this very good point that MND actually tracks the waiting time from the point of a successful BTO. But again, in reality, the experience, at least from my brother, he has actually gone through 4 different applications, of which 3 were unsuccessful, and it's finally on the 4th lucky draw that he was able to get his BTO. And this interesting observation by Hazel is that from 2012 to 2021, the number of resident marriages and the inflow of new citizens each year is actually relatively stable. So, leading from Paul's point about having a fixed number of flats which are built and can be made readily available, these numbers can actually be tracked and is actually observable, and there's actually data on it. Right? So there's actually no good reason or good excuse other than the broad policy thinking that, you might have empty flats left during certain years where there are black swan events, that this could be a waste of resources. But other than that, the data points and the number of flats that you actually need to build moving forward is actually relatively stable, and that's something you can actually plan forward. So again, she raised this point to say that there were 100,000 units built in a total of 5-year period, which is now projected to be 20,000 units from the year of 2021 to 2025. But statistically, if you trace back to 40 years ago, over a 5-year period from 1981 to 1985, the HDB has actually completed 189,000 units, which is an average of 37,900 units per year. So again, statistically, and this is 40 years ago when the technology, the productivity, the labor capacity was very different and probably at a lower capacity, HDB was already able to build close to 40,000 units per year, which is double of that's currently projected. Right, so with our growing population and our increasing demands, again, we do not see why there isn't a political commitment to want to do more for the people, right? So when we look at accessibility and TFR, I think PSP supports WP's proposal to lower the eligibility age for singles to buy HDB flats from 28, and that singles be allowed to buy 3-room flats or smaller. And this with the intention that singles who own 3-room flat will be able to get married immediately and have children while waiting for a bigger flat. So this is actually a practical and I think a doable solution, which increases accessibility for Singaporeans who want to start their families young. But however, apart from addressing accessibility issue, the elephant that remains in the room is actually one of affordability. And interestingly, I found this chart from an online financial blog, sidley.sg, in June 2022, which talks about what seems to be a typical Singaporean financial journey. And I see quite a number of young Singaporeans here, so please let me know if this is a reflection of what you're going through, right? So the projection is that by the time they have their first child, there's an estimated total expense of $427,000 that's taken into account. So starting from the repayment of a student loan, which is estimated at $30,000, the commitment currently for HDB PTO, which is about $300,000, and you know most Singaporeans actually want to spend a bit to celebrate their family for their marriage and their wedding. So an average of $27,000, renovation of $55,000, and by the time they're ready to bear their first child, that's another $14,000 plus minus. So all in, you're looking at close to $500,000. So when you have ministers saying that, oh, I haven't had anyone tell me that it's too expensive to have a child, they probably haven't seen this chart because, based on ground narratives and surveys, it seems like Singaporeans do have to struggle quite a bit before they can even start planning for their first child, right? And again, there are ground surveys done by Marriage and Parenthood Survey, which show that married couples do want to have more children. And interestingly, about half of the 3,000 over married respondents aged between 21 and 45, 92% indicate that they actually do want to have 2 or more children if they can afford it. And this result seems to be fairly consistent with past surveys which are done in 2016 and 2012. So that's almost a decade worth of data. And again, not surprisingly, the top 3 reasons cited by these people who have given the survey results is financial cost, right? Which is the high cost of raising a child. And I think the earlier graph sort of suggests that. So if we look at one of the examples shared by our NCMPs during the recent Parliament debate, they have looked at the cost of owning a BTO flat. And if you look at the current costing, which is the down payment for a flat that's estimated to cost $350,000 in Tinga, right? Upfront, you're really looking at paying 10% down payment on the signing, which is about $35,000, and another $10,000 on the collection of key, and another $5,000 plus for stamp duty. So all in, you are already looking at $75,000 plus your $30,000 loan. So question is, how long would it take for a polytechnic or graduate couple to save $105,000, right? So when I did the math and I tried looking at some data, which is the salary for polytechnic graduates. So one survey suggested it was about $2,600 in 2022. For university students, it seems to be a wider range, between $3,010 to $6,000 for computer science. Interestingly, I note that those who seem to be earning the lower mark are those in the music, and there's one group of study that's actually into Chinese medicine. So I think the more niche your study is, it seems to suggest that the income for that might be a bit on the lower end. And so if you look at that, and if you take the average of, let's say, a couple who's either a poly or graduate couple, and if you add their income times 12 months, and you multiply that by, say, 20 to 30%, assuming they do manage to save that much, it would take an average of 4.4 to 6.6 years for them to even hit that initial savings it might require for them to buy the current BTO. Right. So yes, while there's a lot of conversation about reducing the waiting time for the flats to be readily available, I think the reality is that so long as BTO remain at the current high pricing, you are going to be faced with a situation where young couples are going to have to wait that long simply because of the fact that they need to save up for that period. Just another interesting set of data which I found online as well, which is about the current rate of employment. Although it was acknowledged in the survey that that's taken at a half-yearly mark, right? But what's interesting to me is that half year from the time that polytechnic student graduate, you actually only have about 60% of them in full-time employment, which again is another important criteria for any young couples thinking about whether they are able to commit to a mortgage long-term. Versus, I think, the number of people who are actually freelancing or being employed in some level of part-time work, there's actually quite a significant percentage who are actually doing either gig work, or maybe there's another 8.2% who are not even employed. So when you look at the totality of the situation and the ground situation right now, the fact is that the sustainability of the income might actually be another criteria that young couples will have to think of before they commit to their first BTO. So coming to PSP's proposal, I think one of the major proposals that was canvassed is actually the Affordable Housing Scheme. And the crux of that is to suggest that the land cost can be deferred when the flat buyers purchase a flat from the HDB. And this is to take into account the fact that the land cost currently is actually on the rise. And so if you're able to defer the land cost to a later point, then the situation on the ground would be in the reverse, where the situation is such that you are able to save more from your CPF, and you are able to accumulate the interest in your CPF account when your savings are not touched, or at least a significantly less percentage of that is actually used for the purchase of a BTO flat. The upside to that is that such costs will only be paid when the flat is sold after the minimum occupational period. So to the extent it really helps with younger families and couples who are going to start their family, where the upfront costs will actually be significantly reduced by this proposal. Of course, there's a lot of conversation about whether there will be an impact on the reserves. And I think the main point that was put forward during the parliamentary debate is to show that 80% of our NIRC was actually never used except during some exceptional years during the COVID times. And these are essentially reparked into the endowment and trust funds. So for example, in 2019, you actually have about a significant amount, or 80% of this NRC, which was actually being plowed back into funds. And in contrast, whereas if we talk about the total land cost that's paid by HDB, that only amounts to about 3 billion, which is a small percentage of that. So our overall conversation is to say that, look, the affordable housing scheme actually does not have a significant impact on our reserves because the land cost will eventually be paid back to the government. And even if that is not being paid back, this amount of 3 billion is something that the state can actually fund from the allocation of the NIRC to our budget. The other proposal, which I thought was actually quite interesting as well, is a millennial apartment scheme, which is to increase the number of housing units in prime location by building smaller units for rental. So the picture you see over there is not exactly the image we have proposed, but this is my idea. But I think it will make for an interesting possibility for younger Singaporeans who want to start businesses. And I think one of the interesting data that I found is a study that's done by the Bank of England, where they have showed that if there is actually an increase of $55,000 in debt, this could potentially reduce entrepreneurship by 10 to 12%. So if this ratio is actually true and observable in Singapore, the fact that you have an ever increase in your BTO pricing and your general house pricing, the fact is that this also feeds into people's mindset of whether they want to get into businesses, whether they want to get into their startups, and the ultimate impact this has on the country in terms of our innovation and productivity could be significant long run. So not only is it a measure of providing more affordable housing for the young, but I think one of the key issues that we should be looking at is how do we have viable, sustainable rental models for young Singaporeans such that they can take on more risk-enabling ventures. And I think this would be, again, an interesting proposal for the incumbents to really explore. So in a mixed environment where you have accessible, amenities, whether it's for recreation, clubs, and we are talking a lot more in terms of co-living and co-working spaces. So this model to some extent might actually be attractive and easily received by the younger Singaporeans who are prepared to start working in more engaging environments. So we think that this could be a model that could be explored further. And finally, a quick word about low-income single moms. Recently, there is this conversation which has been brought up by WARE. And what they found is that single moms above the age of 21 can apply to buy resale flat or BTO in non-mature estates for up to 3 rooms. And there are a number of schemes which are available, but there is a difference between those who are purchasing as divorced or widowed versus those who are purchasing as single moms, right? And the difficulty is that much as they are entitled to some of these grants, it's actually not entirely equal, like I said, because of the earlier policy angle, which is the idea that you must be married. So the fact that you're a single mom, there are still some distinctions that maintain in our current grant and our current grant allocation. And this is made worse by the fact with the finding that the median monthly income for single unwed parents under 35 is actually one of the lowest, between $600 to $700 per month. So one of the more progressive proposals, which I believe Manwa and Hazel might be looking into at some point, but the proposal, at least from AWARE, is to free up housing and to make it readily available for low-income single moms for up to 2 years. So their proposal, which was done based on the study, saw that 2/3 of the women actually saw better job prospects, and the median income from this woman actually rose from $500 per month to actually about $1,150 after they joined. And with a more stable environment, this actually allowed them to exit abusive or toxic relationships or to actually acquire new skills. So generally, I think where we're coming from is to actually look at long-term solutions that will enable flats to become affordable and allow more CPF savings to accumulate while moderating price increases. And at the same time, for the younger families to provide some level of stability while they're waiting for their flats and to ease the burden on Singapore while providing a more vibrant environment for them to socialize. So I believe there will be a Q&A session, but if you have more questions, you can always reach out to me on my social media. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That was certainly very comprehensive, and it was a nice illumination of what we've been hearing in the media from Manwai and Hazel in Parliament. And so for the last presentation, Azhar is going to present to us an industry perspective on the housing price situation. I think, do we need the remote? There you are. Okay, it's come up.
Hello everyone. My name is Azhar Sulaiman. So basically, I'm a real estate agent with PropNext. I deal mainly with public housing, HDB. Of course, every now and then, if my clients requires, I do private property as well. I transact around 80 to 100 buy and sell every year. So I'm like consistently the top producer in PropNext, the largest real estate company in Singapore. So what I'm sharing is basically more on ground thing, lesser part on the BTO aspect as what the others have shared. So for me, I'm more concentrated on the resale market because I feel it's a chicken and egg thing. I always on the ground you always hear, oh yeah, the price is so high, it's because of the government or because of the PAP, this and that. But actually not so true because the sellers are the one asking high price and it's also not the seller's fault. Buyers are willing to match that high price. So I think both are at fault. So you cannot just blame it on the government and all that. You know, like for example, Pinnacle Duxton is 1 million plus. If nobody want to buy at 1 million plus, it won't go up 1 million plus. Yeah. So I will share more on that later on. So, but first and foremost, I feel okay. First and foremost, basically, I'd like to concentrate on increase the supply of flats and also reduce the demand because I feel there's an uneven supply and demand. That's why it's a problem for the resale market. Is everything so high price? Number one, the increase the supply of flat. Property owners that own more than 2 or 3 or 4 properties at the same time have to give up their HDB flat. I'm sure they had benefited from it back then. They bought it at so cheap and all that. So, but now they had 3 or 4 or 5 properties already. They can just release or sell it back to the government or the open market. So there's more supply in the market. That's number one. Number two, of course, increase BTO supplies. As our speaker had spoken just now, there are potential to build more. I'm sure they are working on it, but even if it's not enough, they can always go to DBSS again. DBSS are public housing built or developed by private developer. It can be considered even if they feel overwhelmed, which I think they can, because like she mentioned just now, back then they built 40,000 a year of public houses a year. So now it's only like around 23,000. I think more can be done. Number two, this where I concentrate more on is to reduce the demand or reduce the buyers out there. Because right now, like I mentioned, there are too many buyers and too little supplies, like too little sellers out there. High income earners shouldn't be allowed to buy a resale flat. Currently, household income of 14,000 and more, you cannot buy a BTO or sales of balance flat. I think it should apply to resale flat as well. Why? Because this group of buyers are also the ones responsible for pushing the price up, because they are the one that can afford 800,000 4-room flat. They are the one can afford 1 million worth of HDB flats. So I think if household income of 14,000 and above, you can move on to private properties or if case by case basis, allow them to only buy EA or EM. At least we safeguard 2-room, 3-room, 4-room, 5-room for the future generation so that it won't be overpriced or unaffordable for them. Okay? So yeah, that's for the high income earners. Next is PR. PR should be banned from buying HDB. Right now, the current practice is if they have a status of 3 years and above, both husband and wife, they can buy HDB. I don't think we should allow them to buy for now. At least in the future, when the supply is more, you want to allow them, it's fine. But for now, I think we should stop allowing them to buy any more HDB flat because the supply is is shortage lah, basically. And also on ground, I'm not sure whether you have heard, many of my colleagues or friends have been complaining that their colleagues are selling away their flats because they are giving up their PR. Although PR is permanent residency, I don't think it's so permanent. They will enjoy a huge windfall at the price of others. You see, they are taking that spot or that HDB flat where others would have needed it. And you also heard of PRs are the more richer one that are pushing up the price up and all that. So I think we can settle it or by not allowing them to buy any HDB flats lah. Next is reduce the amount of loan for new buyers to get their home loan. Why? Because I think it's a bit scary moving forward because of the Ukraine-Russia war. You see tech companies laying off a lot of employees and all that. It's only good to let them borrow lesser. Borrow lesser, I'm sure people will be more angry because they will say everything is more unaffordable, everything is more expensive. But gradually, I think the price will drop. Because if there are lesser buyer that can afford 1 million or lesser buyer that can afford 800,000 houses, it will generally drop. We as agents, sometimes I heard on ground, so, this is agent fault lah. We are not the fault here. We are just working within the system. If my seller wants to sell high, we can try. But if nobody wants to buy at that high price, we will generally push the price down also. So that's why I feel if there are steps to let them borrow lesser, it will be a win-win situation. The price will drop and it will be more prudent for them to not pay certain things at high price. And then the next one is I think we should reduce the percentage of CPF amount used for all houses. At the moment, this only affects buyers who buy old flats, or if the lease of the remaining flat or the flat doesn't cover them until 95, you can't use the full 100%. If you are using bank loan, you can use 120% actually. But for me, I feel it should be reduced to 80% of the CPF for the house. So for example, 500,000 worth of property, you can use only up to 400,000 example. Why? I feel Singaporeans are so pampered, so spoiled that in a way that I have clients that, I don't want to use any cash at all to buy a house. I feel, in a way, if you think about it, only in Singapore or very few countries in the world that actually allow buying a house using non-cash. We are the one of the lucky ones that only use CPF, or some like die don't use CPF. So I feel reduce the amount used for the house. It works both ways as well. Like I mentioned, prices will go down a bit, and it will also help them to save up for their retirement. They can grow their CPF and all that. I just give you a quick sharing. I calculated last week for a client of mine that is 35 years old. He got 180,000 worth of CPF in his OA. If I calculated for him, if he keep his 180,000 in his OA, 20 years down the road, when he's 55 years old, he will have easily 290,000 worth of CPF, 110,000 compounded interest just like that. But not many of us are taking advantage of this system actually, because all our CPF are in the house. It is not growing if the price of the house is not growing. Because I personally also had transacted a client that sold his EM at 600,000, but it's a negative sale of minus 200,000. What does this mean? It means the CPF had accrued interest of 210, but he doesn't get anything at all back. So meaning the CPF doesn't grow at all, and then there's a negative sale of minus 200. So I think this is moving forward. Of course, it's not a popular thing to do, but I think it's for the goodness of everyone, for future generation and all that lah. And the sandwich class. I also propose for our sandwich class. This sandwich class is very, sometimes in Malay we call it kasian. We always have like grants or whatever rebates only for the lower income, but the sandwich class doesn't get anything. And then they are also not lower income enough to benefit that, and also not rich enough to not feel the effect of any inflation. So for me, I would propose for those citizens that want to own a second property at the same time, it must be private property of course, they should do away with the ABSD. ABSD is additional buyer stamp duty. It is extra 17%. 17% of 1 million is extra 170,000. There is a lot of summon that you need to pay, 170,000. So I don't think any sandwich class here would want to throw 170,000 just like that. So I feel we should do away with this, so there's more home ownership, private property in a way, and it will also solve the problem of the rental market. Right now, rental market is also skyrocketing. I just closed a Bukit Batok 3-room rental at 2,900. It's a 3i model. 2,900 is the price of a 5-room flat 4 or 5 years ago. And that 3i model doesn't have even a kitchen cabinet. It's a 3i model means there's 2 toilets in the kitchen and all that. I ran it up for 2,009. It's quite crazy actually. So basically, if you allow this sandwich class to have a second property for investment purposes, private property, don't get mistaken that I'm allowing them to buy HDB. But if they have a ready-made private property, they can allow it to rent out and all that. It will bring down the price of rental. I feel, of course, not only the house purchasing price of houses are high, but rental are also high, which is affecting our foreign workers and all that basically. And then there's a valuation system. I honestly do have a problem with this valuation system way back then. Why? Because right now it's being valued according to the price of a flat. Recent transaction in the area and all that. I don't think it's fair. Why it's not fair? I give you an example. 4-room Pinnacle at Duxton last year sold at 1.37 million for a 4-room flat last year. So, and if you look at the transaction around there, there's quite a number of $1 million properties being sold or transacted. So I'm sure the valuation will be around 1 million or 1.1. Cash COV of 200,000, 100,000+ is huge, but the rich can afford to pay. But my suggestion is, you as HDB, you have to control it. There must be a cap. Example, this is just an example. For Pinnacle Duxton, for 4-room flat, the highest you can value a house is 700,000. Example. So whoever want to buy at 1.3, they have to pay additional 600,000 cash over valuation. If you got the money, by all means. If you do not have, you find a cheaper flat. Something like that. So they need to have a ceiling cap because if right now the valuation or the price of our house being dictated by the rich people or the market, which I don't think it should be that way. If you want to do that in public, in private property, it's fine. But public housing, you should do something about it before it goes out of hand. So as you can see from the news and all that, last year HDB price index rose by 10%. The year before that was 12%. So all in all, 20+% already. So every year goes up by 10%. We are really, I can't imagine how much it will cost when my children start to buy houses So the valuation system have to change. As mentioned you have a proper control. And when HDB have a proper control or more control, they can also make it appreciate every year steadily. For example, follow the inflation rate or follow your CPF accrued interest or interest rate. Or when the price of when there's lease decay towards the end of HDB, right? You can steadily decrease it, controlling it. Do not let the market set the trend or set the price because everything need to fall gracefully or increase gracefully as well, right? So I feel the valuation system need to change, need to be tweaked a little bit more so that it's better for all of us. And then there's newlywed couple scheme also, which I in a way also agree with what they had proposed. I think this is very important also because I see a lot of young couples apply BTO even before they got married. Some haven't got engaged, they apply BTO. Some haven't even proposed to one another, they apply BTO. So I'm sure there are quite a number of cases whereby they cancel the transaction or case or whatever before they even collect key. I myself as agent, I sold units before within MOP with green light, of course, because that went through divorce. Quite a number of them. So I would propose something like this. They allow first-timer young couples, short-term lease, not so short, maybe up to 2 years, 1 to 2 years, so they can experience living with the partners for the next 1 or 2 years. So after 1 or 2 years, if you can withstand your partner, then you apply a house. Because sometimes the problem is you can't withstand them and all that. That's where the problem is. That's where you cancel everything. But I feel it's one way to try it. So at least they don't incur so much at the start. Because there is a research done. The second highest number of divorce happen during the first 4 years of a marriage. The first 4 years of a marriage means these are the times when they apply BTO. These are the time maybe they collect key after 1 year, divorce already. That's where all these are happening. So my point is, if they do go on to this step, the rental route, at least they are not taking away the opportunity or spot from others that need the house more urgently and more, more genuine in a way. So so they should be allowed to do this only once. You cannot do this 2 years with every 2 years with a new partner. You can only do this once, and of course at a lower rate, market rate lah, so they can experience this genuinely. So that's all the suggestion that I have. If I have more data, of course I can make fine tune it better. But these are just my humble suggestion that I have from the ground. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks very much, Azhar. I just want to put on record, SDP does not support promoting cohabitation. That's his own personal view. It's interesting to hear views from industry. We're going to open this time up to the floor, and I'd like to invite Mr. Khoo to give a few comments in general, or maybe with regards to the PSP and the old SDP proposal.
Hi. No, it's okay. I was asked to prepare some questions for the panel actually, but then I said I have not heard what they are presenting, so I don't know what to ask. What has been really odd to me recently, and in the last 2 years, I've gotten my calculations wrong, is because I started the last 10, 15 years of my real estate life doing research and market analysis. And I always start with the fundamentals. How many bodies are there in Singapore to fill how many dwelling units? So I use the word dwelling units because I'm using the catch-all phrase for residential properties. And if you're taking total population, then you have to use dwelling units in the form of HDB flats, private properties, private residential properties, plus, because it is total population, you have to add on workers' dormitories, you have to add on student hostels, as well as even short-term service apartments and hotels. So my starting principle is let's use fundamental analysis to build from ground up the model, then I can predict whether Singapore property residential prices will go up or down. And with that, I was relatively successful earlier on predicting market trends. So I was the first person to call for Singapore to cross $4,000 per square foot. A lot of people were very unhappy with me. That was 2006. My forecast was that within 3 years, based on number of en blocs, flats, not flats, private properties that were being torn down versus the very slow pace of construction. I have brought up this point about our very slow construction pace to the authorities. Slower and less efficient than labor-expensive countries such as Japan and Hong Kong. Hong Kong's labor costs way above Singapore's, Japan as well. And we are slower than them, and we have got very cheap labor. So at that time, my forecast, yes, it was correct. In fact, it crossed 4,000, went up to $6,000 per square foot. Subsequently, of course, we had the global financial crisis and, of course, property. So you look at employment, you look at population, and you can sort of look at next few years, how many marriages per year, births and deaths. So I'm one of the very few, I think, a bit morbid people in Singapore who also track deaths and baby births. So comes to the last 3 years, all my forecasts are out. And in fact, I wanted to add one more data point to the charts just now. This week, the Department of Statistics just released our household income numbers. And this, every year, February, using the household income numbers, we also see what is the Department of Statistics number for total number of households, Singaporeans and PRs. And the total number of households for Singaporeans, PRs, merely increased by 9,000 households. And in the last 12 months, we had an increase of almost 20,000 dwelling units. So if total number of households net addition is 9,000, total number of dwelling units only had added on 20,000. Why is there such a hot rental market? I'm a licensed property agent. I own my own agency, and so I know that the market is... So there's been a mismatch ever since COVID struck. That there is suddenly, seemingly a lot more population, but yet Statistics Department has said that the total population today is still fewer than the population in 2019. So I'm adding on more confusing numbers, and I'm saying that, I'm admitting that I'm totally muddle-headed now. I can't read a direction, and I'm totally taken by surprise about how hot the market today continues to be. So something might be amiss in the open data that you and I are reading. And therefore, without good, transparent data, we are unable to really make good proposals for policy for the way forward.
Okay, I'll give you my theory. My theory is it's all the hot money coming from outside. Because, you know, in the condo where we used to live, there's so many transactions that are occurring, and yet there's so many empty units. So people, buyers coming from overseas are just buying because they want to get the money out of wherever it is that they're coming from. And they perceive this area as an area where the price can only go up. I mean, it's a freehold condo, so that it was a freehold condo, so that was part of the reason. Wendy, any?
I was going to say the same.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hot money coming in with land banking, I think being one of those factors. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's this other mindset. So during the COVID times, right, a lot of HDB rentals were pushed up because suddenly there's a lot of workers who are stuck here. So they were prepared to pay higher rates. And generally the mindset is that once something goes up, it's never really going to come down that easily. So that might be one marker that's also pushing pricing upwards.
219.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And the Malaysians who are stuck in this side
Correct.
Yeah.
have already
Gone back. It's true.
Correct.
and Johor prices are below 50% of 2019 level.
Correct.
So you could go back to Johor and live in a very luxurious space
Right.
for much less than 2019.
Right.
So again, the numbers just don't square out for me.
Yeah.
So maybe we have to recount the population numbers.
It's very, very,
I
very
think there are also
interesting.
recent changes in policy where Singaporeans who have sold private condos and houses might gradually want to move back to a HDB, but currently with the minimal
Waiting
period that they
period.
have to stay off, they might be considering the rental of HDB or maybe even some condos. And again, that might be another influx of supply that's pushed up demand.
Again,
Your
total
guess.
number of humans
Yes.
is less than 2019.
Yeah.
Total number of housing units has gone up by about 60,000
Right.
versus 2019. So number of bodies is fewer.
Right.
Number of dwelling units has gone up.
Well, that's your empty BTO, right? In that sense, I mean, in the private sector, empty BTO, hopefully there are not too many of them.
Okay, the authorities have said, I mean, this was a direct answer to me. My question was, have you checked the vacancy rates of HDB flats?
Right.
And the answer was no. HDB has assumed that all HDB flats are occupied, except for those that are under the HDB leasing scheme.
Correct.
Then on the private residential side, URA tracks by checking on PUB records
Right.
the vacancy. So today's vacancy is about 22,000 units. 2019 vacancy was about 35,000 units. So in fact,
It's gone down.
occupancy has gone up. More and more bodies are occupying the units. So for the hot money buying and then leaving it empty, maybe the PUB bills are still being paid, and that's why,
Right.
yeah. That's why I say there's too many numbers that are sort of like off and I'm unable to then give any proper tracking and forecast.
Okay, so that's one big mystery.
Yeah.
So back to the main question though, which is the purpose of public housing, which I think all three of us kind of agreed on, even though we had slightly different perspectives. And the idea is that public housing is a safety net. It's something for people who cannot afford to buy a condominium or landed property. They need to have a roof over their head. They need to have a safe environment with the required amenities. So, any other questions from the floor? I think to sum up, basically, as we've heard, the market is very complex. There's dwellings, there's dormitories, there's all these factors which come in. You know, we do house visits. You see some houses, see 20 pairs of boots outside. You know that somebody is doing something that they shouldn't be doing. So it's not a straightforward issue. And I think maybe as a lead-in, you know, you mentioned the issue of fertility. So I think Wendy has talked a little bit about that. You want to just make another comment about fertility and how, you know, the housing crunch actually affects this whole concept of TFR?
I mean, so we have been doing some groundwork as well, and I remember going to this 5-room HDB flat, you know, young couple, and that's not the only couple I met, but there were two couples who struck me in particular. One was a mother holding a baby standing outside the corridor, and another just came home, you know, on a regular Sunday morning. And so when we're discussing about housing issues and the increasing cost of it, one of the ending note, and you always see the mother looking a little bit sad about whatever that's going on. And two of them, without us prompting for that kind of response, basically said, you know, I really don't think I can afford having a second child. And that's heartbreaking to me, you know, as a woman, and seeing her and how she loves her first child. But she sees that realization in her face, that looking at all the cost, the housing costs, the bills, and maybe there's some job uncertainty as well, we don't know. But the reality on the ground, if you engage with the residents, is that they are feeling it. You know, and if your ministers are not seeing it, and if they're not saying it in their face, it's probably because they're not doing the groundworks, you know. So I think, apart from data, apart from surveys, I think those are the direct responses we are getting from the Singaporeans that we're seeing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And in fact, people my generation are struggling with the idea that they are now being asked to help their children with the down payment, because that's something that never happened to our generation. See, it's like, I mean, my father gave me a loan when I went overseas to study, and I paid it back, and he was very pleased with that. So when it came to the house, he said, it's up to you. You decide how much you can afford. But you can't tell, I mean, my friends can't tell their children that anymore because of the fact that the down payment that is required is just so high. So I think it has an impact. Any other questions? Yes, Suyong. And then...
I just wanted to add to Wendy's table just now about the $8,400 salary and affordability. So Wendy used the $8,400 and then multiplied by the 25% for the MSR mortgage servicing ratio. Note that our household income tables, most of these tables, depending on where you extract the data from, includes employers' contribution to CPF. So a household husband and wife income of $8,400 is actually 1.2 because of the employer's 20% contribution, right? Employers today is 16 or 17, 17% contribution. So that if you net it off, actually the cash take-home pay of that couple is about $6,000.
Yeah.
And then they'll have about $2,000 of CPF, most of which would be used to do the loan payment. And that is why in the last few years, I've actually started to help more families with their retirement and estate planning for handing over to their next generation. And a 60-plus-year-old couple, I see both of their CPF statements. One person had 8,000 in the OA at 60 over years old, and another person had 30 over thousand in the OA. partly because of using it to pay for their 4-room HDB over so many years. And so at 60-something, that amount of money in the OA means that we are going to see a lot more people depending on Class C wards and a lot more subsidy if bad health happens to them. And then by the time they live until 80 years old, I'm not sure, depending on how filial their children and how high earning their children might be, how will they be able to even feed themselves? So these are my concerns as a citizen.
Good point. Next question.
Hi, my name is Dave Lowe, and I used to work in the real estate industry. So it always occurred that why is our government not doing something the Australian government is doing? And that is to say that you can buy a new property as a foreigner, but when you sell, you only can sell to local. And with a policy like this, I'm sure we can control the escalating and runaway prices the private property sector is moving. So this is one point. The other point is very good, what Azhar brought up. The valuation is always a question mark. All right. The valuers are chasing after the selling price and not the other way around. All right. I think that's one area that valuation, Singapore valuers should ask themselves. All right. And you know how easy it's done? Valuation is done in Singapore, it's just a phone call away to a valuer, so-called appointed valuer by the banks. And when the banks want to lend money, the more the merrier, right? Because the banking product, the bank has money, money is their product. So if they want to lend more, they ask the valuer to coordinate with their loan. So this is something that we should really spend some time looking at it. And of course, the social problem, like what Sui Yong has said, Wendy has said, yeah, it's very sad. And I don't know why we are in self-denial that property price is still not high. I think we should really ask ourselves, it is high, and it's affecting everybody. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll get Azhar to answer the private property question.
It's quite true regarding the valuation, and I don't think it's consistent either. I share with you one case example. My buyer saw this house. When we asked for the price and all that, the seller's agent was saying, oh, there's a buyer, but the buyer back out because of 25,000 COV. True. Then I negotiated 5,000 lower. So we are expecting to pay 20,000 COV. So my buyer entered immediately after the OTP expire. Immediately. Yeah? So we do revaluation again. The valuation go up by 20,000 in 3 weeks. That's how ridiculous it is. I don't think it's fair. I think something is wrong somewhere. So that's why it need to be scrapped. I mean, in a way, tweaked in a way that is fair for everyone. Yeah, about the valuation thing.
Thank you very much. There's another question. Elvin? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alvin. So both of you hinted just now that a lot of hot money is coming into Singapore, which is increasing the trend of rising property prices in the private sector, private market, right? And I think to some extent that has a cascading effect because Singaporeans feel priced out of the private market, and therefore they are moving to the HDB resale market, which causes increased demand on the HDB resale market from high-income Singaporeans who should actually buy a condo, but now they are buying the HDB resale market, right? So which is causing escalating prices as well. Because they can afford those prices. So to some extent, part of the issue is with international hot money coming in to buy private property in Singapore. Are any of the opposition parties thinking about proposing banning foreigners from buying private property in Singapore?
That's a very, very, very difficult question. I think Dave has actually hinted at the Australian solution, which is foreigners can buy, but they can only sell to locals. So, I mean, that's something that is certainly worth considering. The reality, though, is that this is not an exclusively Singaporean problem. You know, if you go to London, you go to Vancouver, I mean, the amount of hot money that's coming in to London, to Vancouver is just incredible. And I don't think, and you know what it's done? It's forcing people to live further and further away. So people are commuting, you know, now there's strikes, the rail strikes. I was just on a Zoom call with 2 academics from the London School of Hygiene, and they say it's so hard for them to get in. But, you know, we don't have that kind of buffer, see, unless you're going to have more and more people living in JB, which is going to create another issue. But I think in reality, the management of hot money is something that is a bigger issue, and it's something that SDP has actually talked about from long time ago, in terms of the global regulation of hot money, where the hot money is coming from, and our roles as a global citizen as well. And unfortunately, it's not getting better; it's actually getting worse. So the short answer is we don't have a solution, but we don't think that that just allowing unbridled hot money to come into Singapore is got net positive effects. Wendy?
So I don't think that absolute ban is something we have discussed internally as well, but what I did touch on briefly in the last general election, when I stood as a candidate in Tanjung Pagar, is to talk about a more fundamental problem. And I think at a macro level, what I'm seeing is that we are relying a lot on this hot money, the over financialization of our economy, largely because our productivity is so much dependent on the growth of land capital, right? The increasing of leases, the increasing of land price, which is tied to rental. And therefore, what to me is the fundamental issue is that there's actually no real growth of innovation and productivity in Singapore. Right, and again, through my engagement with residents when I did my ground walk, one of the key questions I actually asked them is, what is the big international homegrown Singapore brand you can really think of? And for a long time, a number of them still say SIA, Creative, and which are the brands I knew of when I was growing up. But if you're thinking of the next generation of up-and-coming brands, I know Charles and Keith made some wave recently, but they themselves are sold to an international brand, right? So what is this that's really driving our economy? And if we really take that reflective step back, I'm afraid that the truth is really going to hit us really hard. And so currently, I feel like a lot of our policy in relying on the incoming immigrants, the foreign talents, the driving of family offices, which has grown a lot in the last couple of years, right? That, to me, is a mask-up for what is a more fundamental problem. So I think, at least from my perspective within PSP, I feel that a lot more needs to be looked at in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship. And I think that's why we have tied in with our millennial apartment scheme to say that we need more affordable housing for the young graduates, the young polytechnic graduates who are coming out to take a bigger step in terms of risk. And one way of helping them mitigate that risk is to look at opportunities where they can have communities for support, but also affordable private housing if they so wish to move out from their parents' home. Yeah.
You said the magic word, innovation.
Yes.
And from the front, and then after that, behind you. Yeah.
Hi, this is Nyap. I just want to ask a question as follows. The world is very big. Any problems or anything you ever see in Singapore are being faced by the rest of the world, other countries. Can you share with us how this housing issue, the policy and all that stuff, are being, let's say, addressed by other countries? Maybe the rest of the Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, or even, let's say, Thailand, or maybe some of the more advanced countries like Sweden, Finland, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand. In a few aspects, first, when you compare about affordability, how are their medium income compared to their comparable 5-room flat within, let's say, US or within Canada or within even Thailand? Secondly, for our 5-room flat that we have in Singapore, what can they buy in all these countries? And how many countries are in the world have to finance their house using your retirement fund?
Okay, I'm going to start. So first off, Singapore is very unique. In that 90% of the land in the country is owned by the government. I don't think there's any other democratic country in the world which has 90%. I mean, North Korea, maybe 100%, but that's about it. You see, so we are very, very unique in that situation. Probably the closest to that is maybe Greater London area, where the Duke of Westminster is holding the leasehold. And there's a 99-year lease, 100,000-year, 999-year lease, and you pay up to the Duke of Westminster, at the end of that. So I haven't made a detailed study of this, but from what I know, the UK has tried various means of social housing. they do not depend on the government to provide housing for such a large, no other high-income country in the world, actually no other country in the world provides this kind of, non-socialist country in the world provides this kind of level of government ownership of housing. So what they do is they have social housing, and they've had a bad track record where some of these areas end up being very notorious districts. So what a lot of these countries have done is they have mandated, if you're building a condo, you're part of your you have to reserve a certain amount for social housing. And you may have heard some of the stories where in Manhattan they have a separate door for those who get subsidized versus the main door with a doorman for the private. And that, of course, defeats the purpose. But in a sense, it assures a low-income person of the ability to have a safe place to stay in a decent kind of environment. So I think a lot of the Western countries are moving towards integration with a mandate for a certain number of units to be subsidized for Wendy or Azhar, any thoughts?
So I remember watching this film, Happy, right? And it talks about the reasons why people are happy across different parts of the world. And I remember distinctly there was an example made of, I can't remember if it was Denmark, but one of the Nordic countries. And so there's a lot more focus on community spaces within social housing. And if you recall, a generation back, maybe in the 1980s and all that, when we were all growing up, maybe not all, I think there's a younger segment here. There's a lot more community spaces within your HDBs, more void decks, basketball courts, people playing sepak takraw, I remember. And to some extent, when you go to visit, especially during recent Chinese New Year, visiting some of my younger cousins in BTOs, a lot of that community spaces has been either integrated with other maybe sports complexes, or a lot of that social community and spaces are sort of taken away in the newer designs of your DBSS in your BTO. I mean, the outlook of it looks a lot more expensive, almost condominium-like, but in terms of the social dynamics, the community spacing, the support that's being given in this Denmark example that I was referring to, there's actually kitchens where children can be left to be taken care of by the older generation within the community. There's a lot more integrated support. And so when you look at a system like that, it's not just about the housing, but how you're actually looking to building homes for the community in the longer time. Yeah, so pricing aside, I think that's unique to a lot of different countries depending on the policies they have. But to me, what would be a bigger question is how do you really build homes and communities within our spaces?
Good point, Azhar.
Yeah, just now I want to touch a bit about allowing foreigners to buy, but they have to sell to locals. I don't think it's quite applicable here. For example, Dyson Boss buy a super penthouse for 300 million, and if they were to sell to a local, I don't think they find any local buying that, for example. So I feel another way is to protect the private property in a way, something like what Malaysia did, where you can't buy a certain range, like below 500,000, you have to buy above 500,000 or 1 million, something like that. But if you were to force them to sell to Singaporean, I think it'd be a bit tough, especially we have ABSD and all that. But I always encourage foreigners to buy properties here. In a way, it also builds up reputation for Singapore as a whole. But just that we need to, like what doctor say, let them buy and rent out, so it will cater to the supply of rental markets. It won't be so high and all that lah. Yeah. So, but I totally agree. The new BTOs now have lesser space for communities and all that. Even the playgrounds, some of the playgrounds, they didn't have even place like back then where there's seesaw or even a swing. They have. I think more need to be looked at lah. Because I, as an adult, I look at the playground. I also do not know how to play with it. You get what I mean? Because back then then we would play hide and seek or police and thief. This is like, how do we play this? Then I literally use YouTube to find how to play that. There's, if you have seen videos at the playground, need to like climb one. Then it's so tough for an adult. So yeah, carry on.
Okay, can we take the last two questions together from this gentleman and then this gentleman? We'll take them together. Here first, and then can you get the mic? Yeah. Oops.
My question's for Dr. Paul Tambyah. So I think your proposal for the non-market public housing is a principled solution. what do you think will be the impact on the wider housing market if it is implemented, as well as how maybe you can flesh out a bit more details of how you would see it working? Would it be immediately open to all Singaporeans? And what would happen to the existing stock of open market public housing?
And then the other question?
Hi, my name is George. Actually, it's a really follow-up to the question that was asked earlier as well. I was wondering if you could say something about its impact on younger homeowners, especially first-time homeowners. My consideration here is, if this policy is implemented, how would it affect social mobility and inequalities among first-time homeowners? Given the fact that now HDB no longer becomes an asset to homeowners, right? And it really changes the narrative of social aspiration among homeowners. And I believe Azhar would have a lot more information on this. You have helped first-time homeowners, right, upgrade it. And right now, in the last 30 years, this has been a narrative, right? Get the HDB, use the HDB's profit to upgrade, and that counts as social aspiration, social mobility. So how would your policy address that consideration? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I think both of the questions are directed to me, so I'll answer them. So the main principle that we have is actually related to the point that Wendy made earlier, is that we want Singapore to grow by innovation, by creativity, by freeing the minds of Singaporeans. Singaporeans are very creative people. Okay, I hate to say this, but the world's best match fixers are Singaporeans and Malaysians. Okay, so if only that kind of talent and energy could be channeled into healthcare, into computer technology, into artificial intelligence, and if we had the world's best artificial intelligence people, you know, I mean, that would be something tremendous. So I think, I know it sounds sort of heretical, but we think that the future for Singapore is not making money by selling your home. It's making your money by creating something that's going to change the world, you know, by finding new drugs, finding new vaccines, finding new technologies, helping people who cannot walk to walk. So we do acknowledge that there will be an impact on people who believe that the path to the future is through buying and selling, flipping homes. But we think that that's a price that Singapore probably needs to pay. Is that, sure, there will be some people who will flip homes and will but the broader picture is that we see Singapore as a small place. You see, no natural resources, you know, like Denmark or Switzerland. So you depend on innovation, creativity, and coming up with something new. And that's sort of the core of SDP, you see. We believe in, you know, people say human rights and all this freedom of speech, freedom of expression is airy-fairy. But in reality, that's the only way you're going to be able to think differently, is if you have the freedom to think, why is this being done this way? Why can't it be done some other way? So moving back to the first question, which is about the impact of the non-open market flats. So it's very hard to predict, but we did a projection when we came up with this original policy. And the implication is that there will, because we will retain the open market option, so those people who are intent on selling the flat, monetizing it, if they need to do it, you know, those who have to leave the country or you know, move with family members somewhere else, they can still do that. But it's that it will not be a ever escalating, in a way, bubble to a certain extent. Because from now on, see, you buy a new flat from HDB, the majority of them will be the non-open market flats, which will be for individuals who want to just live in it for the rest of their lives. And if they leave, they want to sell it, they sell it back to the HDB. There was some discussion, I think you were involved in that with Keng Soon and Lam Kiong when we first announced the policy. And they suggested some tweaks to the policy, putting in certain conditions at which you could convert a non-open market to an open market without going back and forth. But actually, the PSP proposal has got some similar kind of principles. Do you want to say anything about that?
In terms of the affordable housing scheme?
Yes, that's right.
So I think at the end of the day, it's really about deferring the land cost such that in fundamental terms, what you're paying, and I think what this gentleman has mentioned, right, is to really look at paying only the upfront construction cost and maybe a location premium to make that more affordable based on what we know as the median household income, right? And so I think leveraging on Paul's point, one of the study done in China shows that actually there's an inverse relationship between the growth of asset versus entrepreneurship as well, which is when generally in China what they've observed is that there's been a huge property bubble, right, which only burst recently, but in the time that it's grown by leaps and bounds, a lot more of the younger population is actually relying on asset growth as opposed to going to businesses. And so I think this mindset and this narrative that Singaporeans have been allowed to believe that, you know, your BTO is your first pot of gold, you should cash it out and go for that paper chase. I think over time you would come to two realizations, I think, speaking on behalf of some Singaporeans. One is that you'll find that while you have become richer on paper, but the next asset that you are acquiring is actually smaller, both in terms of size. So while you, maybe, you know, 5 to 10 years ago, for that same amount of money, you could have gotten, say, a 3-bedroom condominium. But by the time you saved up and you cashed out of your MOP, you might actually realize that, yes, while you have actually acquired a certain profit from your sale of the BTO, but on paper, you might be able to purchase only a 2-bedroom condominium for the amount that you've been saving up for, and maybe only in a suburban area. So question is, are you successful by that process? And then the next question, which I think a recent article has pointed out, is of this Singaporean couple who have basically rented out their property here, but have decided to retire in Penang because they find that the quality of life in Malaysia now is something they can reasonably enjoy just based on rental of a Singapore property. So again, the question is, are you really becoming wealthier when you're forced to leave your country, but you can only rely on your asset here to give you a rental income to sustain it? Right.
And I would like to address that a little bit because, as you know, I have a lot of young couples that I am the one who also push them, buy BTO, you get your first pot of gold, let's buy condo, then you can do this twice in your lifetime. So it's an entitlement for you. That's what I feel. And because it's the system as such. If you don't want to do it, it's your loss, but it is as such. But I tried so hard, I got 80 to 100 transactions in a year, right? I tried so hard, only 1 or 2 made that move. Meaning, there are a lot more that don't want to make money on. They just want to have bigger space, bigger this. Maybe it's different for every race or whatever, but my target audience or my clients are doing that. So even with a NOM scheme, there will be take-ups, but I'm sure there will be some who wouldn't want to take up, but it's up to them because at SDP proposed there is a choice for them to either go NOM or the normal market lah. So yeah, don't worry lah. I think there, because and especially those elderly folks or the lower income or those very pious group or religious people, they don't want to think about money one. They just want a simple roof over their head. That's why I really agree with NOM scheme. To tweak it further, I feel the NOM scheme should be able to use CPF at lower rate lah. Don't put so much CPF in there so they can grow their CPF again back to fully utilizing our CPF scheme lah. So yeah, that's from me lah, addressing both of them.
Okay, thank you very much. Now on that note, I'd like to thank our 2 speakers and all of you for coming here. There's refreshments, so we have a lot of expertise in this room. So please feel free to hang around and chit-chat and ask them for questions. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.